First up, we have Brad George, the CEO of Orosur Mining. Orosur, as I'm sure you know, are a small cap gold explorer listed on Toronto's TSX and the London AIM market. They have a market cap of £49 million as of today, and there's a real buzz about them on the bulletin boards. The company updated the market on the Anza Gold project in Colombia 2 days ago, and George will expand on plans for Anza tonight, I'm sure. Orosur released positive results from the first hole and have seen sufficient positive visual indicators from the other 4 to extend the initial test drilling program. Over to you, Brad.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brad George. I'm the CEO of Orosur Mining. In previous presentations, we've spoken about the history of the company in its wider context, but clearly, in light of the announcement yesterday on our drilling results and the response to it, the focus is on Anza. So tonight I will concentrate primarily on Colombia. A corporate snapshot, the obvious takeaways here being 2, the reasonably positive share price movement since October when Agnico joined us in Colombia, and clearly a healthy cash balance of circa $6 million that we built up following a £4 million capital raising in November last year. I've made the point before that Orosur is not a new company. In fact, it's been around for quite some time, having operated the San Gregorio mine in Uruguay for over 20 years, producing about 1.5 million ounces. But all mines close, and closing is never fun. And so there was a few years of reasonably lean times until late last year when Colombia began to move to the fore. And so while Uruguay is still there, albeit being wound up now in an orderly fashion, we now regard ourselves as predominantly a Colombian company. We're not alone in Colombia, of course. The Mid-Cauca belt in the northwest of the country is increasingly becoming the place to be in this part of South America. We only saw last week in Australia, Los Cerros announced drill results from a recent hole, 380 metres at 1.5 grams from surface. We see different styles here, from the large low-grade porphyries all the way through to the smaller but much higher grade epithermal vein deposits, chief of which is the Bolitica deposit north along strike from us, which is currently over 11 million ounces. Importantly, we have quite a large land position of over 200 square kilometres, which covers quite a long strike length of 2 major structures, the Tenosco and the Aragon faults. Roughly half of our package has been granted. The remaining half is at the application stage, and we'll look forward to moving that into granted status this year. The joint venture is a complicated one over quite a long period of time, covering $26 million over a 12-year period. We're now in year 3, so we have something like 9.5 years to go. And should the project go to completion according to the timeframes, Orosur would end up with a residual holding of 25%. I won't go too much into geology, given the nature of this audience, but just to give you some regional context, we are in the northwest, we're in the Mid-Cauca belt. It's a major structural zone running north-south, and quite clearly we are directly along strike from Bolitica, which is a nice place to be. On a local scale, things are more complex, as geology always seems to be. I'd noted previously that the gold events we were seeing were quite young. They were late Miocene, so really only a few million years old. But the recent drilling, and indeed the old drilling, is showing an earlier volcanogenic massive sulfide system. Now, we don't know whether these 2 things are related or whether they are separate events that simply exploited the same structures. And while this is an academic argument that doesn't impact upon what we're doing in APTA at the moment, it is throwing up some opportunities for us in the wider area, as clearly there's quite a lot going on, and the potential for different styles of mineralization, both gold and base metals, is something that we will look at in more detail as we move to the wider region. When we're talking about the Anzá project, we are, at least for the moment, focusing on the central core, which is the APTA deposit, which has seen most of the activity to date, with drilling of the order of 24,000 metres. The appeal and what has attracted the majors is that it demonstrates most of the key features that you want to see in a gold deposit, namely it had decent grade and it's thick. we're not simply chasing narrow veins here. We are looking at very thick intersections, in some cases beyond 50 metres, of quite considerable grade and a high level of consistency from hole to hole. From the previous drilling, the numbers to a large extent speak for themselves. We've drilled over a strike length of several hundred metres, and the intersections that have been previously announced are in places quite considerable. We're seeing of the order of 40 metres at over 14 grams. Yesterday, we announced the assay results of our first hole of this current campaign, MAP 72. The headline being a reasonably encouraging 70.5 metres at 3.53 grams gold, with some silver and zinc credits and some obviously higher grade zones within that. This was largely a verification hole, but it exceeded expectations by demonstrating a breccia package well in excess of expectations of something of the order of 110 metres thick. This then gave us comfort to step down, dip roughly 100 metres for MAP 75. This has been completed and assays are pending, but visually it has intersected breccia packages of similar thickness, which in turn again allows us to step down to MAP 77, which is currently underway. The other point to make is that clearly there is a polymetallic nature to this ore body. We are seeing in MAP 72 intersections of silver in excess of 80 grams a tonne, and in places zinc in excess of 8%. We don't at this stage understand the economics of this, but clearly it's a good problem to have, and it will require some more metallurgical work for us to understand how this will impact upon economics and mining. Now, in light of these quite exceptional results and the attention that the project is obviously now seeing from Agnico and Newmont, we get asked two questions. The first is, where has the project been all these years? If it's so good, why are we only now seeing it being drilled out? And the second question is, if 24,000 metres have already been drilled, why is there no resource? Now these are fair questions and they deserve an answer, but both of the questions throw up significant opportunities for us going forward. To answer the first of these questions, we need to understand the history of the project. Going back in the day, Anza was originally part of Continental Gold, but they needed to make a decision between Buriticá and Anza was then spun off into Canadian-listed Waymar Resources. Waymar did quite a lot of work up until about 2013, then became financially constrained due to a general collapse in the junior mining sector about that time. Orosur came in late 2014 with a view to moving the project forward and did quite a lot of work. But then Orosur in turn became financially constrained as the operations in Uruguay began to experience some problems. That in turn led to the joint venture with Newmont in late 2018. But then almost immediately there were some security issues in Colombia. And in the beginning of 2019, we began to see the discussions and eventual mergers between some of the major companies such as Newmont, Barrick, Goldcorp, so on and so forth. That then led to Agnico coming in 2020, and then drilling is obviously now ramping up. So the project has always been there. It's always been a good project, but it's really a question of bad luck and bad timing that the project has always seemed to be overshadowed by bigger events. The second question is the technical one. It's where I think things get interesting and where the opportunities become rather exciting. The estimation of a resource, among many things, requires a good understanding of the geological continuity from hole to hole and across the ore body in general. Now, this in turn means that any ore body should be drilled in a way that answers the specific questions that are thrown up, and every ore body will be a little bit different. But as we see in the little cartoon on the right, drilling in APTA is somewhat challenging. We need to cut tracks in, we need to build pads, and then in effect throw the rig over the side. And so while drilling is not in itself expensive, the moving of the rig from pad to pad is slow and expensive. And this led to the tendency by previous companies to drill lots of holes from the one place as a cost-saving measure, rather than moving the rig around to more optimal positions. Now, this led to the result that many of the early holes, while providing good assays, they were not well positioned in terms of estimating a resource. But this is really where opportunities arise for two reasons. Firstly, we can very quickly correct this and move things forward quite efficiently. But perhaps more importantly, it means that most of the APTA deposit, in my mind, remains untouched. One of these issues, and perhaps the least important, is the question of dip. In the early days, it was thought that the ore body dipped toward the west, and as a result, the holes were directed toward the east. And this is not unusual. The dip is often a difficult thing to ascertain early on. But it did mean that many of the early holes drilled down the veins, and while this superficially at times gave some spectacular results, it was geologically misleading. The beauty, however, here is that we can correct this with a couple of holes. We know where to drill given the previous assays, and we can turn this around with one or two well-positioned holes. The more significant issue, however, is, as I mentioned, this tendency by previous companies to drill many holes from the one location into a small part of the ore body. Now, this was probably understandable at the time if the company was cash constrained, because it's a very cost-effective way of generating some good results. But the holes that we've drilled, or the holes that we are drilling up and down dip, are demonstrating that we've got a reasonably tabular zone of mineralisation, and we're seeing a reasonably good correlation and continuity from hole to hole. This suggests that there is potentially hundreds of metres up and down dip that have simply not been touched. And while obviously the results need to be confirmed, this is giving us a high level of comfort that we may be seeing some very significant tonnages here. And the final opportunity, or at least benefit, is the fact that we can see the ore. We noted recently an announcement that as a result of COVID, our turnaround times from the lab had moved out from an expected 2 weeks to nearer to 5 or 6 weeks. Now, this under normal circumstances, if we had 3 rigs running, would be a problem, as we would be in effect drilling blinds. But as we can see here, the main breccia zone is quite visibly stark. It's clearly a breccia zone. We're seeing intense silicification and this pervasive and widespread development of massive sulfides. So while we don't get assays from this, we are able to quite accurately determine where the breccia zone is, and that allows us to continue drilling without any major impact from the assay delays. Stepping back out to the wider tenement area and the geochemical anomalies, I made the comment previously that APTA had been drilled not because it was the best target, but because it was the easiest to get at, a comment that still remains reasonably valid. We see here, however, some very attractive geochemical anomalies north, south and west that clearly require attention, but all require some modification to access agreements. Latahita to the north potentially is a large intrusive source to many of the systems we're seeing here. And Jesuitas along strike to the north on the Aragon Fault, it could well be an APTA analogue. But both of these, while within our lease packages, have not yet been granted, and we hope to move those forward during the year. Guaymorala to the south, on the other hand, is on a granted tenement, but needs some negotiation of land access. Again, we hope to complete in the early part of this year. And so while we've seen some delays to assay results, it's not for the want of being busy. At last count, we had something near to 80 people on site. The first rig arrived mid-November, the second rig late November, the third rig has just arrived and will be commencing work next week. We've drilled 5 holes for close to 1,800 metres. Our original plan of 23 to 2,400 metres is now moving more toward 8,000 to 10,000 metres. We have some comfort now in the potential of APTA. We want to expand and define that, and potentially, if warranted, move that to a resource in the medium term. We've done some geophysical surveys with interesting results. We need to get access to our applications and to the farming country that will then allow us to undertake geochemical surveys to define some more targets that we hope to be able to drill later in the year. So COVID remains probably our biggest challenge in terms of being able to work safely and to move people around. But we certainly have an expectation that over the course of the year, as that falls away, we'll be able to ramp up activity quite significantly. And so to wrap up, looking forward to this year, despite having had a reasonably exciting share price run since October, I'd like to think that there's some gas in the tank yet on a number of fronts. Clearly, the gold price continues to have a reasonable degree of bullish support out there. And being a gold company, it certainly helps to have some, and we have that. 3 drill rigs are going to be throwing off quite regular news flow. And if we, as we hope, increase those to 4 or 5 rigs, then that will only increase. And every hole we drill adds ounces, and over the course of the year, we hope to get a better understanding of the potential size of APTA. The beauty of having a JV locked in with major partners is that we are something of a known commodity. The funding's in place, the majors are paying the bills, we know what the ultimate equity participation is going to be. It's simply a question of the size of potential of what we're seeing in APTA and surrounding prospects. And having a strong balance sheet that we built up from capital raising last year gives us the strength to hold our position for as long as necessary. We have made the point previously that we may be looking at the opportunities, and that remains on the to-do list. But for the moment with COVID, it's on page 2. So that's something we will look at perhaps a bit later in the year. But all being equal, it looks like being a quite interesting and rather exciting year.
Brad, thank you very much indeed for that update. Are you there? Come and join me from Perth, Australia, Brad.
Yes, good morning, Donald. I can't seem to get my video started. Is that you? I'm told you stopped it.
Oh, over to you, Mike. Can you sort Brad's video out, please?
Right, there we go. There's always an IT person in the background.
Where there's a will, there's a way, Brad. So first of all, I've got to say thank you for joining us from Perth, Australia at 2 in the morning. Something like 2 in the morning anyway.
Yeah, I've already had 2 coffees, so fire away.
So how are you feeling?
A bit buzzy, but I'm feeling quite good, surprisingly.
Great. Now that your presentation was very interesting. It was quite backward looking. You put out a cracking RNS a couple of days ago. Let's forgive the pun, drill down on that. What did you see in those first 5 holes which encouraged you to expand the drill program?
There are really 2 key things we see in those holes. I mean, obviously the first hole was verification, so we saw what we expected and that was fine. But we then began to step out in quite big steps of 100 meters. And then seeing the ore zone as we wanted to see it, where we expected to see it, is quite encouraging. So it's that continuity from hole to hole that's really getting us quite fidgety.
And you found the dip now, if I understood you correctly. Previous drills hadn't found the dip, but thought they had, but you've actually found it this time.
We probably found that back in 2017. I mean, it may sound silly that how can you get the dip wrong, but actually it's quite a common problem. So the first drillers were assuming a certain dip on the basis of regional geology, and clearly that wasn't correct. So yeah, it's quite a common issue, and it's not a mistake. It just always takes time to define that.
Okay. What is the evidence that you have so far? Is it sufficient to say that Anza has actually been de-risked, or is it still work in progress?
Look, I think the short answer is yes, it has been de-risked. The long answer is not entirely. The biggest risk with mining exploration, of course, is geology. And we have absolutely no control over, what is there. What is there is what's there. We need to deal with what we find. And while this is highly encouraging, it's good projects are actually quite rare. I mean, it's a sad fact that most geologists will spend their entire careers, grow old and retire, never having found anything of any great note. But that's fine. We have fun along the way, so don't feel sorry for us. But this project, at least to my mind, has the makings of potentially a once-in-a-career opportunity. And that might be an indictment upon my career, but it certainly has the makings at the moment of being quite exciting.
Okay, Mike, can we pull up slide 18 again? Okay, can we see slide 18? Fantastic. Now I'm going to ask you about this, about slide 18, Brad. This is a slide that shows how tightly concentrated the previous drilling programs were, and you've now moved out in 100-meter steps. So what difference has this made, and what have you subsequently discovered by moving out in those steps?
The key thing here is 2. One is the thickness, and the second is what we're seeing so far is the tabular nature of this thing. I mean, that comes from the fact that geologically this was basically formed yesterday. This is very, very young. in geological terms. In Australia, we deal with things that are billions of years old. So there hasn't been a lot of time for this thing to be subsequently screwed up by folding and faulting and what have you. So it's still, to a large degree, somewhat intact. And what this means is that because of the thickness, it's a very efficient project to drill in terms of the number of tons you get per drill hole. If we're chasing small veins, and it's quite a long drawn out process, but this continuity from hole to hole and this ability to find very thick packages of ore means that we can add a lot of tons really quickly.
You were mentioning a figure of 110 meters and lots of intersections. For non-geologists, those are both very good signs, are they?
Well, they're very good signs. I mean, everyone says grade is king, but really grade and thickness are king. And it's far too early for us to be giving numbers, but we are certainly at this point madly scribbling diagrams on the back of fag packets. And you start adding dimensions to this thing of 50 meters thick, 500 meters high, 200 meters wide, and working out volumes and tons. And you very quickly find that you start adding up tons and ounces at quite a rapid rate. I mean, it's not beyond the possibility that if we start getting more of these whole 72 similar results at wide spacing, we're adding potentially 1 million tons and 100,000 ounces per hole. So it will be a very quick project to build the tons up.
Okay, now you may find this a tough one to answer, but it does follow on. Do you think you and the Agnico and Newmont joint venture are still on track for the world-class tier 1 gold mine in Colombia? What do you think? You're there.
Okay. Define world class. Look, I think the answer is probably yes. I mean, obviously we're not there yet, but from what we've seen on the early holes, this is not something you see very often. I mean, to get these kinds of numbers over this kind of width and this kind of depth extent, it certainly has the makings of something world class, yes.
Yes, and you said you think there's still gas in the tank yet, if I can quote from your presentation. So that's why you think there's still gas in the tank. This is a biggie.
Well, yes. I mean, we are drilling on a very, very postage stamp size part of the project at the moment, and we're coming back with really big hits. Once we begin to step out, then who knows how big this thing becomes. Okay.
Wolf Earth asked by email, what are the problems you expect to come across in the next 3 years? And I don't think he's referencing getting up at 2 in the morning to speak to us.
I suspect there'll be millions of them. The issue
with the big ones. What are the headline problems you expect?
The big issue always is going to be geology. I mean, we're not building Volkswagens here. This is an industry, or this is a process over which we have absolutely no control of what we find. We just have to deal with every hole as it comes along. So there is a constant process of making up as you go along. But the other problems are going to be ultimately the bigger we become, the more attention that we're going to receive from the government and the communities and so on and so forth. So as this very quickly, we hope, moves toward a mining project, then we begin to throw up the challenges that brings with it, environmental, social, so on and so forth. So I think those are the issues that we are going to have to deal with, or hopefully sooner rather than later, but the issues that all mining projects deal with, and they are quite good problems to have. Okay, Andrea Scott talks about another level of problem, security issues. She asks, are these of a political nature? What I would describe as in-country risk. Discuss. Political, no. Colombia, in terms of political risk or political security, is one of the top countries to be in. The risk in Colombia has historically stemmed more from bandits and variety of smaller scale violence. And that's what ultimately led to Newmont, I guess, not being able to operate in 2018. That, to a large degree now, has sort of faded away. We don't have the old Pablo Escobar kind of things going on anymore. There's still small scale issues, but by and large, the troubles of earlier years have certainly decreased significantly. Elephant Country, was that a reference to the bandits? No, elephant in terms of very, very large projects. It's a mining term. When you start seeing gold projects of 10, 20, 30 million ounces, we deem that to be elephant country. Okay. I have another question coming in. Peter McLennan.
Put your hand up, Peter McLennan. You're on. You previously mentioned that if initial assay results were good, the JVs might take over drilling in the short term. Do you envisage this will be the case given the recently RNS results?
Look, I don't speak for Agnico and Newmont, but I will certainly have that expectation. They have the right as part of the joint venture to assume operational control at a point of their choosing. And once they become comfortable that the project shows signs of being of their scale, then I would assume that they will do that. But that won't actually change much. I mean, it'll be the same staff doing the same job. They'll just have different shirts on. The only thing that will change is I no longer need to do monthly reports. So that'll be quite a nice change.
A blessing. But you still end up with 25% of the project.
The JV is locked in. If it runs through its course of another 9.5 years, and I don't expect that it will, then we end up with a residual 25%, yes, which is, we can, to a degree, we would hope, be able to sit back and enjoy the ride.
And how are things bedding down with your JV partners? You're playing with some of the big boys. Newmont and Agnico are two top 10 miners. How are things going on the ground?
We love them to bits. I mean, obviously there are obviously differences between a dodgy junior and companies of this size in terms of their process, procedures, bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. The beauty, however, is that neither Agnico and Newmont have any great Colombian presence, and so to a large degree, they're letting us get on with things. And then even if they do take over control as we expect, it'll still be the same team doing the same job. So they're excellent in terms of their funding. They're excellent in terms of giving us access to their very substantial technical skills base. But they're allowing us to just crack on and move this thing forward. So I found them excellent to work with.
Fantastic. Graham Warnock asks, with the JV funding the ventures, is there any need for more share issues, placings? Can we expect a placing in the future?
I would hope not in the near term. I mean, we raised the money in November largely in order to give ourselves the strength to hold our position. Now, as I said, we potentially have 9.5 years of this JV to run. So we need to be in a position where we can stand our ground and not be financially stressed and give larger companies a chance to come in and make our life difficult. So we needed that money. That was what we thought we would need. The capital raising, of course, had half warrant attached, and should the share price carry on as we hope, they'll be exercised and give us a few more $1 million. So we are reasonably comfortable that if we continue on this joint venture, we're in a pretty good position in terms of cash. New projects, as I said, we are looking at new projects that may in future, who knows, require more cash. But with COVID, those things are certainly on page 2 of the to-do list. So I wouldn't expect those to come to the fore in any near term.
Okay, now here's someone who's keen. John Morris wants a geology guide to the region. I wonder if you could give him a reference book. I think he wants to be as across this as you are yourself.
Look, I don't have one handy. I'll maybe put a few up.
If you could, that'd be very helpful. John Morris wants one.
Go and Google. There's plenty out there, and they're all often very dry reads. So I wouldn't be.
That's what he wants to know, though, Brad. What's the least dry read?
The issue, however, is that geologists always tend to like to put their deposits into little pigeonholes, but it never really worked because every deposit is different, and we like to say it's this or it's that, but in reality, it's a bit of this and a bit of that. And so I think what I will say, without being pompous, is this is probably a project that will itself in time become the subject of august papers. So just give it a while.
Okay. Another question for you, from Ben Jones this time. You've brought in Nick von Scherning. Apologies for the pronunciation. What's your reasoning for this at this stage? Thank you.
Well, there were several reasons. We needed to have another director, largely by dint of some of the Canadian rules, which have a slightly more complicated requirement for directors. So the question was who? And Nick is someone that brings with him a reputation that neither myself or Louis do. I mean, Louis and I know what we're doing. Operationally, we're quite comfortable with how we run the company, but we don't have that institutional name around town. And ultimately, as the company grows, we want to begin to attract more interesting, that's the wrong thing to say. larger institutional shareholders. And for that, it helps to have someone with an outstanding track record amongst that institutional space. And Nick brings that with him in spades.
Fantastic. Okay, final question. Can we expect drilling from Carrascal and Guatemala during this drilling campaign? Do you expect this, and do you expect to, this is a cheeky question, do you expect to receive better drilling results from those? As if you've not delivered excellent drilling results.
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, the focus is going to be eventually drilling on at least 2, probably 3 projects simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So I think drilling at APTA will continue. I mean, at the moment, we're just doing the wide spaced to get a sense of how big this might be. And once we know that, then we'll come back in and do the very boring resource conversion stuff. So that's 1 or 2 rigs. And then the other rigs, once we've done some more geochemistry, identified targets, then we step out and drill probably Guatemala first, and then the projects to the north and so on and so forth. So we have a rough schedule in mind, but we would like to think that in reasonably short time, we'll be drilling on a couple of projects at the same time.
Brad, thank you very much indeed. You're a complete star. Thank you so much for getting up in the middle of the night to speak to us. Okay. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Go. Well done. That was a great start to the evening. Okay.